no part of the world is uniquely privileged, no people uniquely fitted for civilization. There is in sum no single cradle of civilization, no single technology tree story, and no part of the world untouched by civilization, if you like, no part of the world in which there is not an origin story of civilization, no part of the world in which there is not some cradle of civilization. Okay, so that's the, I guess, more theoretical part of the discussion today. Let's talk a little bit about these actual cradles of civilization and what we know about them today. So the well-known cradles of civilization are the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia, or which, Mesopotamia was one of those regions that Isaac talked about, but also the big river valleys of eastern China around the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And I'm going to also talk about one other cradle of civilization, you could say, which is the Eurasian Steppe, the Great Pontic Caspian Eurasian Steppe. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about these and talk in the next episode about the many different environmental cradles of civilization that there have been all around the world. But looking at these three, I'm going to use a book for a bit of variety other than Felipe Fernandez Amesto, which is Barry Cunliffe's By Steppe, Desert and Ocean, The Birth of Eurasia from 2015. And it's a wonderful book. Cunliffe is an archaeologist, and he grounds the remarkable story of the emergence of many different cultures across Eurasia in the complex interaction of culture, environment and geography, and how the communication between civilizations was both enabled and constrained by environment, geography, and indeed climate change in different periods, and is how that story of the nexus of human society with environment, geography and climate was so fundamental to these cradles of civilization. So first of all, let's talk about the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia. Now, in Barry Cunliffe's book, there is a wonderful map where he takes like a map of Europe, from Europe and the Mediterranean and Northern Africa through to sort of a bit beyond the Iranian plateau in West Asia, and twists it about, about 45 degrees or something like that, so that the Straits of, if you can imagine the Straits of Gibraltar between Spain and North Africa are around about 10 and 11 o'clock, and there's almost like a straight line going up between the sort of Red Sea up to through the Mediterranean to those Straits of Gibraltar. And right in the centre there, in the sort of region of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, to eastern Turkey, then bending round into what would today, I guess, be Iraq or Iran, into the traditional area of the Mesopotamia, along the big river valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates. That arc is known as the Fertile Crescent. And what Cunliffe points out about this is there are kind of three big spokes running off this Fertile Crescent. One goes up into the European peninsula, and then there's the Nile Valley, which stretches out to west and the south, and then to the east you have the Iranian plateau. So not only did was this Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, which he calls the Southwest Asian Core Zone, fertile with many, many different little niche, little ecological niches, lots of little microenvironments of mountains and lakes and all this sort of thing. It had this close connection to these big spokes of Europe, Iran, or the Iranian Plateau, and the Nile Valley, along which the developments of civilization would spread. And indeed, the core of Southwest Asian core itself became something of a battlefield between different cultures. And so the process of the emergence of the cradles of civilization that Cunliffe describes broadly goes like this. So until about 10,000 BC, Eurasia was occupied by hunter-gatherer communities with various subsistence strategies geared to their particular ecological niches. And they would all adapt to different patterns of climate and population growth. But there were a couple of particularly well-favoured environments in what he describes as the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent and the valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze that were able to give stability to their food-gathering pursuits by bringing selected grasses into cultivation and by domesticating some of the animals that they had previously hunted. And once these were in place, a more sedentary life in towns with agriculture and storage of food in pottery began to emerge. And indeed, large surpluses of food were generated and stored, and state systems or civilizations resulted in Mesopotamia, the valleys of the Nile, the Amu Darya Oxus, and the Indus, as well as China, but we'll get to China later. And all those zones that I mentioned are sort of flow out from that Fertile Crescent. They're all these big spokes where the civilization got communicated along the way. What he describes as the agricultural package in these peculiarly well-endowed zones began in the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, spread to Egypt and Europe, and across the Iranian plateau to Amu Darya and the Indus valleys. But in the Southwest Asia zone, there was a constant problem of overproduction driving population growth, driving environmental degradation. So there you go, environmental degradation seems to be as old as civilization itself. And this encouraged communities to move away from their homelands in search of new territories. It might have been small, but it began and it helped spread the process of agriculture. And in some of those zones, the environment was a little bit less fragile, I guess, for the environmental impacts. And there's a slightly different story in China. And so that process, I guess, is going over from about 10,000 BC to 4,000, 3,000 BC. And that is really the growth of the birth of the range of civilizations that one's familiar with. Egyptian, Indian, Iranian, European, I guess Arabic, the core Southwest Asian civilizations, all born out of that Fertile Crescent and the spread of certain technologies and social practices in that cradle of civilization. The situation in China was a bit different. These huge river valleys with Yellow River and Yangtze and different kind of products, rice and millet. And these river catchments of the Yellow River and the Yangtze were peculiarly rich and varied, so that they could actually sustain a growing population in a way that the more fragile niche environments of the Fertile Crescent could not. The nature of the soils there in those valleys was less easily degraded and highly, highly fertile. and the irrigated rice fields were frequently flooded, which also supported their fertility. So, as a result, the population grew steadily without crisis, and there were features of the geography, the great mountains rising into Inner Mongolia and, the sort of Tibetan plateau, which provided natural barriers to outward expansion. To the north and west lay mountains interspersed with deserts and steppe, while to the south the lightly wooded landscapes quickly gave way to tropical jungle, into which agricultural practices were slow to spread, and so China became a more contained world. But still, these two agricultural zones by 4000 BC had both become the home of, multiple and complex civilizations. And there was one big corridor between these two zones. That corridor was the Eurasian Steppe, sometimes known also, there's the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, and also forgotten what the more eastern one is called, but anyhow. So the steppe basically runs from Hungary, modern-day Hungary, the Great Hungarian Plain, through Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, into China. It's an enormous thing. Cunliffe describes the steppe as the greatest natural corridor of the world, and it carried many civilizational developments familiar to players of the game Civilization, like nomadic pastoralism, horse riding, animal husbandry, copper working. Many of these likely emerged for the first time on the steppe. And the steppe also connected the emerging city-states of Mesopotamia with the resources of the steppe, and ultimately with the Chinese world, if less securely. And there are multiple cultures that emerge in this area. So Cunliffe describes how three regions, the Near East, or like the Caucasus sort of area, Eastern Europe, like the Balkans, Bulgaria, Western Ukraine, Moldavia, and the Pontic-Caspian Steppe. These three conjoined regions were fundamental to a huge range of human inventiveness over the period between 5000 and 2500 BC. In the Near East and in Lower Mesopotamia, exponential growth in population led to the development of a complex urban-based society complete with monumental architecture and systems of writing and measurement. This is, kind of Babylonia, Sumeria, Uruk. In Eastern Europe, in the Carpathians and the Balkans, copper was produced and cast on an industrial scale. Gold was extracted for the first time, and potters made vessels of exquisite quality. While on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, herders domesticated the horse and learned to ride. They developed the ox-drawn cart and may have even invented it, and bred long wool sheep, providing wool for manufacture into cloth. They all had different bases for food production, like agriculture, irrigation agriculture, dry agriculture, or pastoralism, but they all made a unique contribution. And ultimately, it was also along this huge corridor that the cradle of civilization in the West and the cradle of civilization in the East would ultimately, including in the form of the horse, learn from each other and communicate and connect with each other. So that is a little account then of the cradles of civilization, and also the concept of civilization. Just in closing, I'd say that civilization as a game certainly opens out a window onto history, and one of the biggest and most entrancing ideas in history, civilization. We do not need to overstate the errors of thinking about civilizations in the past. We don't need to think about people as barbarians or primitive, but we can be generous in thinking about the idea of a cradle of civilization. If we disconnect it from the idea of progress, and if we disconnect it and connect it to an idea of a complex process of adaptation of the environment, what Fernando Semesto calls the itch to civilize, the human itch to adapt nature to their own needs, then we can see many fascinating cradles of civilization across the world. With the help of modern archaeology, deep history or prehistory, we can connect with a more plural, diverse and global history of many civilizations across the world. There is no one cradle of civilization. There are many, many cradles of civilization, and all civilizations are born, mature and evolved. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about how each of the main environments or ecological niches in which civilizations have adapted their environments using the system of classification that Fernando Semesto presents in his book Civilizations, and therefore tell a very multipolar story about the multipolar world of our civilizations and some of the lesser known stories of complex civilizations that emerge from that story. So until then, I hope you all stay well, and remember that what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee. Bye now.